show up anyway. So thank you for coming out to support me. Definitely not an easy thing to do. If you've ever stood up here, you understand how hard it can be. But what you also understand and you come to realize is the study that you do as you go through and you get ready and you prepare for this. I had never looked at the life of David the way I have after this message. It's, it starts out that David, we all know David is a man after God's own heart. But we're going to start off with what leading up to David. So at this point, the men of the world, or men of Israel, they've rejected God. And they're asking for a king so they can be like other nations. And we're starting 1 Samuel 8, 6, 7. They say, but the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord, and the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people in all that they say to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. This is setting up the stage for Saul to come into play. And next we have, and Samuel said to Saul, you have done foolishly. You have not kept the command of the Lord your God with which he commanded you. For then the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people, because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. And what's said about David is, one of the young men answered, behold, I have seen the son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing the lyre, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord was with him. When I say David, what do you think? Some people are going to go Goliath. Others are going to go and they're going to talk about Bathsheba. Some are going to think the father of Solomon and the lineage of Christ that extends thereof. Multiple things can come in when you're thinking about the life of David. But one thing that we probably all think of is a godly man, the man after God's own heart. What does it take to be called a man after God's own heart? David had many struggles. David was a man that made very bad decisions. But he always repented, and he accepted what God was going to do to him as a result of that. And that's what we're going to explore tonight a little bit. When you read David's life, you really start to look at it from the standpoint of, it reads like an episode of NCIS or whatever crime show you want to read. The show Murder, She Wrote comes to play, and that's an old show. Sorry if anybody thinks it's not an old show. But I can remember my grandparents making me watch it, and it was just horrible. David's life reads like a Murder, She Wrote TV show. It's more closely related. It's full of plot twists. David starts out as he's still the main character, but he starts out the good guy who can do no wrong. Then he turns away from God. He makes the bad decisions. And then all of a sudden, he's the bad guy. He makes a heel turn. And you always wonder what's going to happen next. When you really get down into it and start reading it, David absolutely, you think he's going this way, then he goes this way. What else would you use to describe somebody's life like David's? When you look at everything that he did and all the things that he did and God let him get away with, it reads just like if somebody was going to sit down and write a novel and say, man, we're going to do this, and we're going to have his son go against him, we're going to have him have an affair, we're going to have all this, and then he's going to come out smelling like a rose. That's David. That's David. As the youngest son of Jesse, he was the 8th child. It was tradition for the youngest, as each child went through, they had to go out and kind of do their job. David's job at this time was the shepherd. He was out, and that was more than likely a job that had been passed down from brother to brother to brother, because it was kind of the job that nobody really wanted. At this time, David's probably 10 to 15 years old, had to be old enough to kind of take care of himself, but also he had to be, he wasn't that old, and we'll see in a minute that he couldn't have been like 20, 25 years old at this point. He's a young man. David's left alone for extended periods of time. He would be out there in the field singing to the sheep, alone with his thoughts. He didn't have an iPad. I don't have an iPad now. I hate Apple. If y'all know that about me, yeah, it's just a term we now use like Coke. He didn't have anything else to occupy his time, didn't even have a book. He just had his thoughts and a bunch of stinking sheep, more than likely. That prepared him to deal with the problems that was in his life. God was getting him ready at that point, and David wasn't even aware of it. The next we see of David after he's chosen at this point, he's out there with Goliath. He's standing there. At this point, David's an adolescent. He's between 16 and 19 years old. Again, he can't be 20 years old yet, because if he was 20 years old, he would have been old enough to serve in the army, as we're told in Numbers 1:3. It states anyone 20 years older and older from Levi with Aaron could have been gone out and would have been eligible for battle. David would have been there. So at that point, Goliath is standing there. And as we go through Goliath, different manuscripts paint Goliath as either 6'9" or 9'9". Either way, that's huge compared to where you're starting from. If you're 5'10" like me, 6'9" is huge. 6'3" is huge. I see it every day. Goliath's armor weighed between 78 and 128 pounds, depending upon the manuscripts and what you look at as it goes through. His spear, the head of his spear was 17 pounds, and it was 26 feet long. How tall is 6'9"? We won't even go to 9'9", 9'9", 6'9". Average NBA player height is 6'6". How much is 78 pounds? The average watermelon, when you think of a watermelon, I hope you don't think of the little round seedless watermelon. I hope you think of the big juicy watermelon that we all grew in the garden maybe when you were younger. That thing weighs about 20 pounds. If his armor weighed 80 pounds, think about having to tote 4 of those watermelons around. I like to tote 1 and eat 1. Goliath's spear, 26 feet long. The head of it weighed 17 pounds. When you think about that, the javelin that you see thrown in the Olympics, that's thrown in track and field competitions in high school and in college, is 8 feet long and weighs roughly 2 pounds. How many of you would have been willing to go out there and stand against a man that looked like that? That's the problem. I trust the Lord. I don't know if I would have went out there and stood in front of something that size. That's an impressive figure. Even on the smaller side, that's still a very physically impressive person. David goes out there, and as we know, he goes out there, slays him with a sling. David wasn't afraid. David had already delivered his father's flock out of the mouths of bears and out of the mouths of lions, we're told, using nothing more than a shepherd's hook and nothing more than a sling. That's faith. He stood there and said, "This Philistine has disrespected the Lord our God." And he just knew it. You could say he was a young boy because his brother sure did rail on him. Said he had come down there to see the battle. Said he had come down there to see everybody get killed. That wasn't David's plan. David came down there to take the supplies that Jesse had sent down for his 3 older brothers that were all serving. He just happened to be there. He stood up for what was right. Next, we're going to talk about David with Saul. At this point, David has slew Goliath. Just within the next chapter, as David and Saul enter into the city, the women are singing, "Saul has struck his thousands and David his 10,000s." At that point, Saul gets jealous. If you're the king and one of your servants is getting praised, how do you think that would feel? That's where Saul was. Saul is beginning to plot against David, wanting to kill him. The problem is everybody loves David. Everybody loves David. Saul first offers his oldest daughter to David because he thinks he's going to create a trap for him. David turns her down, turns Saul down. Then Saul offers another daughter. Now this daughter loved David already, so she was more than happy to marry David in the beginning. And David, there was a little plotting going on there where Saul had to kind of go around the back door channel and get some of David's buddies to talk to David about, man, come on, you be the king's son-in-law. Because David didn't want to be the king's son-in-law. He didn't feel that somebody of his birthright should be the king's son-in-law. Who am I? He said that several times. Who am I? That's humility. We've talked about his faith. We've talked about David's humility. Up next, we're going to talk about the frustration that Saul has. Saul, at this point, is infuriated. Saul hates him, can't stand him. His son loves him to death. His daughter that he thought he was going to trick David with loves him to death as well. David is just, and everywhere David goes, he's prospering. Everywhere he goes, he's prospering. Saul can't stand him. Looks like I'm missing a point there. That's mistake number one. Strike one. Saul got so mad at David at one point that he picks up a spear and throws it at him and tries to pin him against the wall. And David came back into his house after that. If somebody threw a spear at you, tried to kill you, how would you react? Well, first of all, it would depend on whether or not they had another spear sitting there beside them or something else that they could hit me with. But, I got a pretty bad temper. David spared Saul's life on 2 occasions. The first time he spares his life, he was in a cave. David still revered Saul. Saul was the chosen king of Israel at this point. David got close enough in a cave where Saul was preoccupied that he cut off a piece of his robe. David showed it to him. Saul still chased him, wanting to kill him. Then later on, David had a little help with this one because we're told that the Lord caused a deep sleep to a certain extent to fall off that stage of Mary. Sorry about that. David snuck into camp where the Lord had caused a deep sleep to fall over Saul's camp, took a jug of water and a spear that was beside Saul's head. And at that point, he escaped. The next morning, he's calling out to Saul's personal bodyguard, saying, I was in your camp. I took your stuff. I could have killed Saul. And basically, that's setting up that person to be put to death. But Saul recognizes David's voice at that point, and Saul calls out to him, David, my son. David's like, it's me. I could have killed you again. And it's then at that point that Saul recognizes that David is not going to kill him. Why was Saul frustrated with David? Saul's frustrated with David because, one, the Spirit of the Lord has left Saul and is upon David at this point. And Saul is being tormented by the Lord with evil spirits. But I believe what really hurts Saul is Saul knows that his legacy is not going to be through his children. Saul has sons that are not going to be kings. David is going to be the king. Everybody I think can understand what it means to say your inheritance is going to go to somebody else. What would that do? What would that do to you? So you can, to a certain extent, Saul made his own bed. He's having to lie in it. Saul never accepted it. David always accepts responsibilities for his actions to a certain extent. So now we have King David. At this point, David was the first king, or he was the king over Judah, and he lived in Hebron at that point. He lived there for roughly 7.5 years before joining the kingdom of Israel. Because during that time, you have to remember, Saul had been slain, or Saul had been injured, and he actually killed himself at that point. And then he asked his armor bearer to do it, and his armor bearer wouldn't do it. He thought too much of him. So Saul fell on his own sword, and then his two older sons died. So one of Saul's centurions, or one of his commanders, basically installed one of Saul's older children as the king. So at this point, you've got two kingdoms of Israel. What does David do? David just continues, just methodically going through. The Lord is with him. Everywhere David goes, he prospers. Everything David does, he prospers. This is still David who does no wrong. David reigned over Israel for 40 years, 7.5 years in Judah, and then another 33 years in Israel, over in Jerusalem with the city of David. When we go to the city of David, we're skipping around a lot because there's a lot of character. I mean, there's a lot of span here to talk about with David. The city of David. When the Ark of the Covenant comes in, David is bringing the Ark to Jerusalem. It says David was leaping and dancing. Can you imagine a king leaping and dancing? Neither could Saul's daughter Michal. I think I'm saying that right. Because she despised him at that point. This was the daughter of Saul who had once loved David, loved him. Now she despises him. She basically calls him a fool for dancing in front of the Ark of the Covenant, and David says, I ain't worried about it. Don't matter to me. I'm going to do what I want to do because I'm right in the eyes of the Lord. David was so upset with her at that point. I don't know if David asked the Lord or if David just never related to her again after that point, but we do know that she was barren for the rest of her life and she never had kids. So no explanation is necessarily given for that, but one of two things happened. David immediately starts to thinking about wanting to build the Lord a house. The Lord at this point has dwelled in a tent. Basically, through the prophet, the Lord tells David, that's not your job. That's going to be Solomon's job. Well, he didn't say Solomon. He said it's going to be your offspring's job. So David had every intention of building the temple. But he was basically told, that's not you. That's not you. You were the warrior. Your offspring is going to build my house. David's triumphs. David's king over Israel. Remember, everything he does just touches the gold. I mean, it's Midas touch. He wins every battle. He doesn't lose. You going up against David? Hang it up. Victories over every king he faced. Think about that. He never lost a battle that we're told about at this point in his career. At this point in his life, David is invincible. He is slaying people by the 10,000s. The Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. 2 Samuel 8:14. Now we get to David's downfall. We knew we were going to get here eventually. Bathsheba. This may be one of the most cold-blooded parts or stories of the Bible that there is. And the way I look at it, I mean, it's right up there with one of the top 10 heinous things that you read. He has an affair with her. He sees her out there bathing, and he has an affair with her. He gets her pregnant. Calls Uriah home under the guise of a counsel. Let me get the news from you. Okay, you've gave me this. Now go to your house. He's trying to cover up. You ever tried to cover up for something you did? Yeah, I have. if I can get away with it, it's better. It's better not to get caught, right? Would everybody agree that sometimes it's just better not to get caught? We know the kids think it. We won't tell them that when they come back out here. But, this is what I say is cold-blooded. When Uriah doesn't go into his own house, when he sleeps at the door of the gate, David writes his letter, gives it to Uriah. Uriah takes it to his commander, and all the while he delivered his own death sentence. Not only did he take his wife, he had him carry out his own death sentence, and he didn't even know it. Nathan comes into play at this point. And Nathan, you gotta love the way that Nathan just comes in and just says, this is what's going on. He uses the story, he enrages David. Because David's still a man after God's own heart. The rich man takes the poor man's lamb. David's going to restore it fourfold. And you can just see Nathan stepping up and saying, it was you. You did this. You did this. And at that point, David is remorseful. Nathan also goes ahead and steps up and says, you're going to have problems with your children. He's talking about Absalom. Oh, and by the way, the child you're about to have with Bathsheba, it's going to die. That's a sin. It's a sin that cost David his child. I mean, David was the warrior. David's also the poet. David's also the psalmist. This tore David's heart out, as it would tear any parent's heart out. David hurt. David mourned. David fasted for the 7 days that we're told the child was sick, hoping that the Lord might change his mind. Fasted for those 7 days. Fasted and was so distraught that his own servants were scared to tell him that the child had died. That's how he lay on the floor face down, prostrate, and his servants were so afraid of what he might do to himself that they didn't want to tell him. But David saw them all talking, and he knew what would happen. David accepted that his son was dead. He rose up, washed and anointed himself, and he went to worship in the house of the Lord. That's faith. That's strength. That's courage. His servants even called him out on it. His servants couldn't understand what was going on. They said, why the child was still with us, you fasted, you wept. Now that the child is gone, you come up. You've arose, you've ate, you've strengthened yourself, you've went and worshiped. David's response, classic. David says in verse 22 and 23, he says, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who knows whether the Lord may be gracious to me, that the child may live. But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him. He's not coming back to me. That's powerful. That's faith. That's the faith of David. A brief touch on Solomon. After the death of David's child, it says David went in and he comforted Bathsheba. And Solomon is a result. In 1 Chronicles 3:5, a chronological order is given of David and Bathsheba's kids. If you can, because there's a little bit there, but in Chronicles 3:5, Solomon is listed fourth in order. So Solomon is still in that birth line, but he may not be second. He's either second or fourth, as where I'm coming from. I did not want to say that he was second and it not be the right, so I wanted to call that out. David goes in, and he has a son. This is a son by one of his other wives, and his name is Absalom. Absalom, by all accounts, is a glorious man. They said, I believe the word was he didn't have a blemish on him. Amnon is David's son by another mother. So brother by another mother. That's where it came from, maybe. I don't know. But Amnon loved Tamar, which was Absalom's full sister, Ammon's half sister. 2 Samuel 13. So he tricked her. Amnon lay sick in the bed, and they convinced Tamar to come and comfort him. And when she came in, he overpowered her. And then the Bible says he hated her he hated her more than he ever loved her immediately after that. This is David's household. This is the story that I was talking about earlier. This is David's life. Think about this now. He's the king, and now he's got basically incest happening in his house with one of his multiple wives. Takes 2 years, but Absalom gets his justice. He convinces David to send Amnon with him out while he's going to shear the sheep, and he basically slays him. This is where David is a different man at this point. David's older at this point. Absalom flees because he doesn't want to face David's wrath. But he wouldn't have had to face David's wrath if David hadn't have left Amnon unpunished for 2 years. For 2 years, Absalom had to walk around while Amnon, who raped his sister, took away her inheritance from that standpoint, walked around. It says that Absalom never said either good nor bad about Amnon for 2 years while he was plotting. So Absalom stays gone. 2 years later, he returns to Jerusalem. Absalom is still upset with David. He starts plotting against him. You know, like anything, whether it's Greek mythology or anything else, there's always the plot. This is David's son, whom he loves. He weeps for Absalom later on, weeps for him tremendously. The coup ultimately fails, and at that point, David is weeping so traumatically that his people had to come get him and say, hey man, hey, you do realize that this is the guy who was trying to kill you and take your kingdom, right? And all David is doing is crying out multiple times, oh Absalom, oh Absalom, oh Absalom, weeping. It's still his son. This to me goes back to David having that tender heart. He's a warrior. Don't ever think that he's not. But he's tender-hearted. He's tender-hearted. The faith of David. David started out so incredibly strong. Young man, tending sheep, killing lions, killing bears with nothing but a rock and basically a slingshot. Along the way, he slays a giant, whether he's 6'9" or he's 9'9", it doesn't matter. He was still a young man slaying a warrior that nobody would even dare to face. It was Saul's job to go out and face Goliath. That was Saul's job. He was supposed to be the king and go out and face the challenge. Saul said, I ain't doing it. So he lets an adolescent boy go out and take care of it. David had the faith to think that when he was done with the son that with Bathsheba the Lord might change his mind. He didn't go be with his child. He didn't go comfort Bathsheba. He mourned because he knew what was coming, but he was hoping that the Lord would change his mind. And when the Lord didn't change his mind, he got up and went to church. He got up and anointed himself and washed and went to church. That's the downfall of David. But it shows David's heart. It shows David's humility. I sometimes wonder if this is what it means. I've been studying on this for a couple of weeks. Is this what it means to be a man after God's own heart? Because we know we're not going to be perfect. But does it mean to love God with such a passion? Admit your mistakes. Readily say, hey, I was wrong, but let me get back on the straight and narrow way. Is that what it means? How many times have we fallen away? How many times have we been going through the motions? How many times have we just said, yeah, I'll go, but my heart ain't in it? I don't think David did anything when his heart wasn't in it. I think his heart was in anything. I think he ran on passion. I think he ran on emotion. David's a hero of faith. David's a hero of faith because early in his life, he's shown that he was basically invincible. David's a hero of faith because he showed us what we can be. David's a hero of faith because he showed us that even when we fall, we can still rebound. David always accepted God's decision, and until the end, he continued to trust in God. Thank you.